The talk, I've given the title, Truths That Only a Story Can Tell. I was torn between that and something a little more perhaps pedantic, though I find it very compelling, which is that line from the 117th Psalm, 117:17, easy to remember, right? The Non moriar sed vivam et narrabo opera Dei. I will not die, but I will live, and I will narrate the works of God. It's a very powerful phrase, I think, which captures the centrality, which is really the topic of this talk, the centrality of narrative, of story, but particularly, I would say, dramatic narrative in the communication of our faith. And I'm going to talk, as Brett said, about the class that I teach. I had a minor epiphany on the way over here on the plane flight from Rome yesterday. It was provoked by the fact that I had a seat in the very last row of the airplane, and from the last row, from that position, I was able to see an excellent view of almost the entire plane. And I was able to see just how many people were watching movies during that 9 plus hours flight. And I myself was able to see on neighboring screens parts of Hellboy, Call of Darkness, the latest iteration of Robin Hood, starring Elton John, the Taron Egerton as Robin Hood, What Men Want, Happy Death Day, parts 1 and 2. The second part was skimmed through by the person who was next to me. I'm not sure whether Bishop Ty and Cardinal Harvey, who were also on the same flight, were watching such films, but or any films at all. But this 9-hour spectacle, especially when you get up to stretch, you can see this screens and screens flickering in the darkness there, really brought home to me in a very graphic way just one of the basic premises of this talk, which is simply how amazingly attached we are to stories. We know the list of films there on the menu is pretty much infinite, or at least you couldn't exhaust it in many flights. And we know that's just the tiniest tip of the iceberg of the number of movies that are produced each year. And many of the travelers, at least as far as I could tell, were watching movies pretty much the whole flight. It was a 9.5 hour flight, and those screens were on pretty much the whole time. Now, I think anyone who see, even from a technical point of view, is something it's marvelous to behold, but I think from a more philosophical point of view, it does make you think, and you could easily, I think, get the impression that all these people, right, everyone hooked up to their own screen, watching their own movie at their own pace, you could get the impression that in a certain sense we're addicted to stories. Now, that sounds negative, but I think one way you can read that is the way that John Cavadini read Augustine's somewhat surprising declaration about rhetoric and the divine origin, the non-human origin of rhetoric, and its force, saying that that's coming from God. It's coming from human nature, and what I was watching on the airplane is really something that comes deep in the nature that God has given us, and it makes us attracted to narrative drama. It's not something simply negative. I think there are some negative aspects to it, obviously, but it comes from something profoundly human, and I would say God-given. Some of what I want to do in this talk is inevitably going to be an apology, really, for what I do professionally, which is teaching a course on literature and the communication of the faith in a school of communications. And I would say that course, Literature and the Communication of the Faith, which I've been teaching now for 20 years, has two, you could say, very broad goals. One is one that was touched on in a number of talks earlier today, which is simply a general humanistic goal of acquainting students with the riches of Catholic literary culture, an enormous treasure chest that people who are involved in communicating the church need to know. And in that sense, you could almost say that I teach a remedial humanities course in one of the Pontifical universities. I think there's also a sense, though, that, and especially I teach the course. It's covers 20 centuries, and I divide it into 10 stages. 10 stages because that's a convenient number and it's easy to remember for the students. Not that there really are 10 stages in the history of Christian literature, but teaching it in that historical way constitutes in itself a story. In other words, the students are getting a story, the story of literature, which I've sometimes called my course the mirror of the soul. It's the story of the Christian soul mirrored in literature over the course of 20 centuries. And it does form a narrative. I mean, there are events and there's peculiarities and there's ups and downs in the story, twists and turns in the journey of Christian literature that do constitute a coherent narrative. And not only a coherent narrative that is interesting and worth knowing, but one whose continuity and its connection with us today is very easy to see. In other words, the same kinds of things that Christians were doing and thinking about and writing about in the literature of the first centuries, you can spot in works of literature in the 20th century and in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And there's a true continuity. And I think that's very helpful for students to take them out of someone talked about immediacy today, right? The immediacy of the digital culture. In other words, you enter into a truly massive narrative, 20 centuries, all languages, all cultures, right? And that's a good thing in itself for the students. Now, that long story takes them, I'd say, from St. Paul in the Areopagus, basically quoting the pagan Greek poets there in the Areopagus, all the way to our own day. I mean, I like to usually end the course with Flannery O'Connor on an American note, but you could end it easily and perhaps fittingly with John Paul, JP2. Where's John Paul II? JP2 quoting those same pagan turned Pauline words from the Acts of the Apostles in his poem, The Roman Triptych. I don't know if people remember that. The year 2000, he has a poem on the Sistine Chapel, standing on the threshold of the Sistine Chapel, and he quotes, the God in whom we move and live and have our being, or those same words which any priest in the Mass on the sixth preface of Ordinary Time is quoting those same, as I say, pagan turned Christian words. So that is, I would say, one part of the justification of the course is essentially a humanistic justification to enrich the students, right? In their knowledge of Christian culture, even to supply, you could say, exempla for teaching. Someone mentioned this morning the effectiveness of using stories when we are communicating about the church. And I think of that as essentially a very traditional rhetorical strategy that's essentially exempla, right? And that's part of the enrichment that the students are getting in my course. But there's another dimension to the teaching of literature in a school of communications, which is the one I talk about in the abstract more explicitly. And it has to do more with epistemology and Christian revelation. In other words, how we understand the faith and how we are capable of communicating the faith. I thought that I would approach this through two authors who were very famous communicators of the faith, Walker Percy and G.K. Chesterton. I think Percy's indebted to Chesterton, so maybe it's mostly Chesterton, but Percy has his own sort of original gloss, we could say, on Chesterton. And it has to do with the nature of the truths that we're communicating in Christian teaching. And as I said, we need to recognize, and this is the point that Percy makes over and over again, that there are different kinds of truths that are equally valid, but are of a different nature. And this is in one of his essays, Message in the Bottle, and it's in the eponymous book of essays. The essay talks about a castaway on an island, right? And he's on the island waiting for bottles that wash ashore, would have messages in them, and he reads the messages and he classifies them according to what kind of truth they are. And some of them are universal general truths, like 2 + 2 is 4, and what temperature of the water boils at whatever temperature, etc. But he says, of course, those are not of any use to him. What he's looking for is another kind of truth. It's not that there's anything wrong with those truths. He needs a particular truth, and what he's looking for is news. He says, news about, for instance, a boat that might be passing and might save him from his predicament. And, of course, Percy's point is that in the modern era, we tend to value the general universal truths that are true in all places, all times, sub specie aeternitatis, as he says, more highly than contingent particular truths. And yet, we are contingent particular beings, and what we need is contingent particular historical truth about what happened in Nazareth and on Calvary, etc., right? About the life of Jesus Christ, a man on earth. He also he deals with the same issue in recounting his conversion, which he tells the story of his conversion in different ways in different moments, depending on the audience. But when he's dealing with a more intellectual audience, he tends to describe it, or ascribe his conversion to the reading of an essay by Kierkegaard called "The Difference Between a Genius and an Apostle." Right? And the difference between a genius and an apostle is that the genius has the kinds of truths that are true at all times and all places, but universally true and valid. Whereas the apostle comes bearing news, and you have to take his word for it, right? It's not something you can be enlightened and discover, right? You have to hear the fact, the news, narrated to you, right? Percy, reflecting on this, right, he says that's what Kierkegaard was unable to accept that. Actually had a profound problem with the fact that Christianity was based on news, paradox of Christianity. But Percy says that's actually not a paradox at all. It's in the nature of things. And he says we make a terrible mistake in our age. In fact, I think he gave this was a talk in the Pontifical Council for Culture, I believe, in the 80s. When we when we adopt or we accept a theory, he says, a theory of sentences, right, of propositions, that overvalues the universal and the general over the particular and contingent. And he says that's the enormous pressure of the prestige of modern science, and he was a chemist, a doctor himself, and he had great respect for science. But he said that the prestige of science has led us to undervalue the contingent truths, the truths that come in the form, he says, of news. Now, the problem, of course, with Christianity is that's how it arrives. Christianity arrives not in the form of the philosophy of the ancient world. It arrives not in a dialogue, a Platonic style dialogue, or in an Aristotelian treatise, but in this unique form, which is the gospel. And while it's true that the early Christians really had no qualms about using the forms of ancient philosophy when they wanted to communicate the truths that were in the gospel, you have Justin Martyr or Aristides, Minucius Felix, Tertullian, writing dialogues and treatises from the very, very first moments. Yet the Gospels themselves do not take that form. I mean, the basic revelation is not in the form of a dialogue or an explanation. It's news, and this is where we connect with Chesterton. I'd say that in the case of Percy, he talks about this particular contingent truth as news, and Chesterton tends to talk not about news but about stories, right? And I think many people have read Orthodoxy, where he talks about how his attachment to the fairy tales of his youth, adventure stories, romances, in the sort of literary genre sense, as being a preparation for his conversion. He was looking for a life that corresponded to the richness that he read about in that fiction. And where did he find that richness? Right? In Christianity. In other words, the Christian message corresponded and made possible his participation in that kind of story. That's ultimately what we're looking for, is the way to participate in that kind of richness, the kind of richness that makes people watch 9 hours of movies that every day. Now, I probably should, this is an aside, but going back to Percy has an entire, a very major part of Percy's thought is about the negative effect of our attachment to literature on our capacity to live. In other words, the person who's watching those movies may in fact have a very hard time, unless he's G.K. Chesterton, right, finding that richness in his ordinary life. And in fact, he's in danger of draining his life of that of richness and dramatic content by essentially drugging himself with high octane drama in the form of novels and film nowadays. But the point with Chesterton is that Chesterton does find the way in Christianity to participate in the kind of story and live the kind of life that he dreamt about, based on his reading. Because stories are, as Percy says about news, basically they're the natural form that a non-discursive, non-propositional truth takes. When you're dealing with a particular person and their actions, in order to communicate that truth, there's really no other way to do it than to tell a story. You can't have science of Bob, right? Bob is not the object of a science. You can say all sorts of things, scientific things can be said about Bob, but Bob, as much as he is Bob, is outside the realm of science, right? There's no science of singulars, right? It's one, I think, in the first question of the Summa. But we are singulars, right? And if I want to know the truth of Bob, I'm going to have to hear about Bob. Who Bob is what he's done, what he has lived, his life. There's not, the truth of Bob without telling something about his story. Now, the church has not only the Gospels, which tell that kind of truth, right, about Christ, and I think it also has, as I said, this vast treasure of stories, of narratives that are communicated, not just in literature. I think also you can find narrative elements, right, in paintings and music, etc. Drama, obviously. But I think that in teaching communications in the church, it's important, I think, to legitimize, right? In other words, to counteract what Walker Percy was talking about, right? The theory of sentences that overvalues the general and the universal, or to make a point of privileging the particular and the narrative and that kind of truth, because it's the kind of truth ultimately that we're looking for. It's the kind of truth that's found in the Gospels, right? And if you set out in life looking for that universal general truth, you're not going to recognize the truth that you actually need, which is, this is Percy's main argument, which is we're looking for the truth about a person, about Jesus Christ. Now it should be said, I think, and this is obvious in the case of Chesterton, that all stories, simply by the fact that they're stories, can perform this function. I'd say the function of being, in a certain sense, preambula fide in a formal way, in a formal sense, so that you are prepared to appreciate the importance of a narrative, right? It's possible that the most important, we should be in the frame of mind that says it's possible to receive the most important truth of all in the form of a story, right? Now, it's not a preambula fide in the sense that we need to overcome an aversion to stories. Obviously, what I was talking about on the plane, we are not averse to stories at all, right? Our taste, for drama is obvious for everyone. The real issue, though, here, and this is why it's important to the Catholic communications teaching, pedagogy, isn't whether we like or need stories. We obviously do like and need stories, right? But rather, it's how we see stories and their place in our lives. In other words, are they as important, really, as our viewing habits would suggest, right? And I'm saying that we should take seriously our viewing habits. Those addictions tell us something important about what kind of creature we are and what kind of redemption, right, we need. And this involves this legitimization of that kind of truth, the narrative truth, involves breaking the monopoly of another kind of rationality, which is the rationality of modern science. So we need to, we could say that our intellectual estimation of stories needs to catch up with our praxis. Which our praxis is actually very pro-narrative. Right? Watch everyone who downloaded or whatever the Stranger Things last week, right? The Netflix thing. I mean, I don't know how many people would have watched that, but obviously, many hours last week were spent watching Stranger Things, right? And everyone knows it's false. It's all made up, and yet in Christianity we have the same kind of story that is actually true, and it's actually our story. And we need to prepare people to get used to thinking, as I say, what story, what drama am I in, as opposed to thinking, how do I fit into the system of existence? That's the science story, or the science question. How do I fit into this system? What kind of cog am I in this great machine, right? As opposed to, where am I in this story? Or another sort of generalist view would be looking for the kind of Gnostic, the Pope likes to talk about this, right? Gnostic formula, like the key, the one truth that will just kind of open up and explain the whole of existence to me all at once, right? Now, Pope Benedict, B16, spoke about Christianity as being an option in favor of rationality. And what he meant is that the Christian proposition is as you could say, a bet on reason, on logos. The bet being that in our cosmos, reason, rationality, we might say, goes all the way down, all the way to the roots. The fundamental basis of existence is reason, and it's in God. And in other words, it's not an epiphenomenon of necessity and chance. Reason goes to the bottom, all the way down. But if we follow that line of thinking, we need to recognize that for Christians, that means rationality goes all the way down to a freely acting trinity of three persons, divine persons. And the actions of, the free actions of three divine persons are going to be told in a story, right? Ultimately. And that's not saying you can't say things about the nature of God. But when we're talking about free actions, we're going to have to talk about the story about creation. God, we have to start telling what God did. So that is, I'd say, the other side of the two sort of justifications for having a course on literature, right? Christian literature in a department on communications. I said earlier that the first justification, in other words, the richness of the literary tradition of Christianity, right, is worth knowing in itself. And I say within that there are also two dimensions. One has to do, I would say, with I think you could use this as a general rule, that Christian literature can be divided in two huge camps. That is, the literature that is an expression of revelation in a literary form. In other words, the literary transformation of the content, of the material that you find in Revelation. And, on the other side, literature that is an expression of the life lived by Christians. In other words, I think in my class, I would say that there's two emblematic figures. They're the first great Christian poets, one in the East, one in the West, St. Ephrem, the Syrian, and Prudentius, right? 300s, in the early 400s. They're the first really major poets of Christianity. And they represent, I could say, one represents one side of this expression of faith, the revelation, and the other is lived Christian life. And Ephrem is the one who represents revelation transformed into art. I mean, almost all the poems of Ephrem are scenes from the New Testament or the Old Testament. Generally, they are poems for feast days, for Easter, for Christmas, the Epiphany, etc. And Ephrem, contemplating that scene, perceives in it the material for a work of art. In other words, he perceives the harmonies, the metaphors, right, that are going to create a drama or a poem or something. I think everyone's familiar with his famous description of the incarnation, right, as the moment when thunder entered Mary and made no sound. It's the shocking image, right? Amazing. But that's very typical of Ephrem. And paradoxes all over the place. He's delighted, right, with that. When Ephrem sees the Epiphany, he sees, the Epiphany, the shepherds adoring Christ, right? He sees, here come the shepherds, There's Jesus. Jesus is the shepherd, pastor, adoring the pastor of the universe, the pastors of the fields, and goes to town. Right? There's a whole poem playing with the ironies of the situation, etc. That is how Ephraim transforms the content of Revelation, right? And he does this in all sorts of scenes of the Gospels and the Bible in general. Prudentius does something completely different, right? Prudentius, the Kathameronon of Prudentius, or Per Stephanon, or Psychomachia, they're all about the life of Christians here and now, well, then and there, right? In 400, and he was a governor, a Roman governor in Spain. He was a layman, and the Kathameronon is poems for different moments of the day, right? For when you get up, when you're eating, when you go to bed, right? And he's not living in a monastery. This is not the liturgy of the hours. This is a layman, a governor, right, writing poems for the different moments of the day. The Psychomachia is this image of the Christian life as an incredibly fierce, bloody battle between virtues and vices. It's the first great Christian allegory that led to all the images that we see. Basically have their origins in the Psychomachia of Prudentius. Peristephanon on the crowns, right, is stories of the martyrs, the heroism of Christian martyrs. So he's transforming Christian life as lived by Christians into art. He's finding the drama, heroicity, adventure, beauty, right, in how Christians live, not in the material of Revelation. My experience with students is that they respond incredibly well to this. I teach students, from absolutely all over the world. There's the Africans, Indians, Filipinos, Latin Americans, everybody, right? And many of them are unfamiliar with most of what they're taught, right? And yet, I'm thinking one of the things that usually resonates most with the students is the Dream of the Rood, right? You must know the poem from the 8th century in England, in which the cross narrates the crucifixion, right? And with all the gory details of the nails that went into your hands went into my wood, and the blood that was embedded was in the wood soaked up your blood, and I wanted to fall down, but I had to stand up and hold you. And it was incredible. This incredible poem that tells you nothing new doctrinally, right? And yet it has this incredible power to give you a fresh sense of the drama of what happened on Calvary. Speaking of that, I was reminded when Professor Cavarini was speaking about De Doctrina Christiana, I always have my students read the passage in De Doctrina Christiana where Augustine says, "Why do we like poetry so much?" It's a great question, and of course he doesn't really answer it in a very Augustinian way. He leaves the question. The question remains unanswered in that passage, but he has a passage from the Song of Songs, and he says, "I just love this, and yet it doesn't tell me anything that I wouldn't know if I had said simply this." And he gives a sort of his prose translation of what is said in the poetry of the Song of Songs, and yet it says exactly the same thing, and yet I want the poetry, not the prose, right? So I think this is deep in our genes, and I was saying the reaction you get from the students suggests that it's still very attractive. This literary presentation of Christianity. We've had major examples of this with the Mel Gibson film, its success in the box office, certainly, or The Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia, some of the best-selling films of recent times, right? Or a couple allegories, and essentially a medieval passion play. We don't have time to get into medieval passion plays. Is actually one of the main things I talk about in the class, because especially obviously in pre-literate Europe, before the printing press at least, the force of communication, we forget about this because that culture of popular religious theater died essentially partly at the Reformation and partly after the Enlightenment, and we haven't really covered it. And yet it was a major, major part of how the church communicated the faith. We're familiar with works like, Everyman in English, or El Gran Teatro del Mundo in Spanish, El Calderón de la Barca, right? But those were kind of elite plays. The popular plays, which were done in town after town after town, right? And all the countries of Europe had their own linguistic traditions, and the whole town would take part. There were guilds set up to take care of these. I mean, that was a world of communication that was incredibly powerful. And we've lost it, and yet, as I say, look at the Passion of the Christ. It is not that it's gone forever. It doesn't need to be gone forever. There should be a way to recover this. I'll just end. Happy to take any questions, but saying I think that we owe it to future generations, I would say, and also just to the nature of Christianity, to preserve, to shore up, I would say, people's appreciation for this kind of truth, right? And as I said, the church has an enormous wealth to share in this field, and it itself constitutes a story, as I was saying. We should tap into that strength, right, and not let it get lost. And remember that, as I was saying, someone was saying earlier, they were talking about second orality. Who was talking about second orality? The secondary orality. This is a communication that can take place, right, in a culture that's not necessarily book oriented, right? Especially now with the capacities of video and film and recording. So we need to on the one hand look back at the riches that we have, not let go of that, and also bring it up to date. And I think there's enormous opportunities to do that. That's it.
Thank you.